Hi, my name is Kristen Smith. I'm the Director of External Affairs at the Blockchain Association. We are a trade association based in Washington, D.C. that focuses on public policy issues. And the biggest issue that we deal with is this question, are we sufficiently decentralized yet? A look at US token taxonomy. And today I am very excited to have a distinguished panel with us. We have Jerry Brito, who's the Executive Director of Coin Center. We have Congressman Davidson, who is a member of the House Financial Services Committee and also the author of the Token Taxonomy Act, which we'll spend some time talking about today. And then we have Alan Cohn. Alan is with Steptoe & Johnson, and he is the co-chair of their blockchain and cryptocurrency practice. So our time is short. I want to jump right in, and I'll start with you, Jerry. I would love to hear a little bit more about the work that Coin Center has been doing over the past couple of years related to this issue of Token Taxonomy Act. I know you guys have done a lot of thought leadership in this space and put out many papers that have ultimately been incorporated into policy. Can you bring everybody here kind of up to speed as to the progress that has been made on this issue so far?
Sure. We've been working on how the securities laws affect cryptocurrency networks since probably around 2015. And that was the time when you really only had Bitcoin. You had Litecoin and the altcoins, as they were called. And this is certainly before the big ICO boom and the idea of just tokenizing everything. And what we could see at that time is that, to us, Bitcoin was clearly not a security because there was no issuer, there's no company, when you have a Bitcoin, it's not a share of anything. It doesn't represent any interest in anything, it's not that. So it clearly is much more akin to digital gold, it's a commodity. And we could see that, and we thought that was pretty obvious, but we could also see on the horizon that folks would be creating new cryptocurrencies. And indeed, at the time, we were seeing folks who were not very reputable. You had some folks who were very reputable, like Charlie Lee creating Litecoin, and that was terrific. But you had folks who were creating new cryptocurrencies, pre-mining, as it was called back in the day, and selling these pre-mined coins with a promise that the network on which they would run would do all number of things, and then they would not deliver on those things. So we could see this happening, and we could see, at some point the Securities and Exchange Commission is going to take notice of this, and they're going to have to make a determination, are some of these tokens securities? And when they do that, we want to make sure that they have the tools to be able to draw a distinction between these things where they're both cryptos, they both run on networks, they're both tokens that you can hold, but one's clearly a commodity and one is not. And so we developed a framework for securities regulation that basically identified the Howey test as probably the case that was going to be used, the test that the SEC would use to make these determinations. And we basically mapped the prongs of the Howey test to the contours of cryptocurrency networks. And basically said, if you are like Bitcoin, where you're completely decentralized, you have no issuer, you're not relying on any third party, you're not going to be a security. And long story short, we presented this to the SEC in 2015. We very graciously were invited by, at the time, it was a virtual currency working group there to present this. We then released it as a paper. And what we've seen is that to date, what the SEC has done is, I think, quite thoughtful and has been following that idea that if what you've built is decentralized, it's not a security. And so you had the DAO report, which I thought was a very thoughtful way to deal with what happened with the DAO and its hack. And what they did there was to not do an enforcement action, which would have been pretty aggressive. They didn't do that. Instead, they issued an investigative report without an enforcement action where they just said, look, here's how we analyze the DAO tokens that were issued, and look, they're clearly securities. And by the way, any exchange that trades these needs to be a regulated securities exchange. So I thought that was a very clear, good way to send the message that, hey, this is how we're thinking about it. Subsequent to that, there were several enforcement actions that underscored that thinking. And then you had Chairman Clayton in testimony before Congress sort of make clear that, yes, there is a way that you can issue a token and have it not be a security. Then you had Chairman Clayton also sort of say outright, Bitcoin is not a security. And then you had Director Hinman of Corporate Finance Division at SEC give a speech in which he explained Ethereum is not a security, and here's how that's the case. Even though there had been, by the way, a pre-sale, and we can get into that distinction. So I think at this point, we've gotten pretty good clarity from the SEC. They've gone as far as issuing now formal guidance. Whereas I think folks were saying, well, the Hinman speech was great, but it's not formal guidance. It's just one guy's opinion, people would say, which is always funny to me. So now they've issued formal guidance that is basically taking the Hinman speech and adding a lot of meat to it. And so at this point, I think it's pretty clear that if what you're building is like Bitcoin, and I think you could have kind of like two tests. One is, if the person who built it could get hit by a bus tomorrow and the thing still runs, it's probably not a security. And also, the person who built it wants to make a change and commands that there be a change made. Like say, Tim Cook says, we're discontinuing the iPad SE. Tomorrow it's discontinued, because that's Tim Cook said so. If the person who initially created the network says, we're going to make this change, and the rest of the community says, no, we're not, and the change can't be made, you're probably not a security. So that's where we are today. I think it's very good. What's, I think, a lot of folks find a challenge is they want to build a network, they want to raise funds as they do that, so how do they do that responsibly? And number two, when they launch the network, how can they be sure that they are sufficiently decentralized? How can they be sure that the SEC will look at them and say, yeah, you're enough like Bitcoin or Ethereum that you won't be a security? I think it's a reasonable person, by the way, a court looking at this. I think there's enough there that they can make the right determination, but that's cold comfort for somebody whose entire livelihood is at stake here.
Yeah, no, I know with our members at the Blockchain Association, we represent exchanges, projects, and investors in this space, that there does seem to be this consensus that you can have things that are securities and aren't, but yeah, that magic moment where you go from being part of a system, again, we know the tokens themselves don't convert. You and I have talked about this many times, so I know what you're about to say, but and when is the issuance or transaction with the token no longer in one camp and has moved to the other is still something that keeps some of our general counsels up at night. But thank you, Jerry. Obviously, a long ways that this issue has evolved over the past several years since you guys came up with that framework. Why don't we go to Alan for a second? Alan, I know you work with a lot of clients here, both in the US and internationally. Can you give us sort of a sense of what they're thinking when they're looking at US securities laws and provide some color as to their thought process?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting issue because as Jerry said, if you followed this along and you're interested in the ins and outs and all of the pronouncements and kind of parsing them, then we've come a long way. The guidance is great. It's good to see regulatory agencies put their thoughts on paper so that people can react against it. But we're still not really at a point where a company that's not as interested in the ins and outs can say, okay, what does that mean that I do? What does that mean that I should do? And I think what you've seen with the progression that the SEC has been working on is they have quite rightfully kind of worked through some of the easier questions first. The Dow report, well, a lot of people could look at that and say, okay, this is granting this is granting profit rights. You could see this is granting equity. So that seems clear. The SEC then took a lot of actions against companies engaging in clear fraud. That seems clear. In the most recent guidance, in the Hinman speech and then in the framework that was issued recently, what you see now is we're down to the hard question, which is this question of how do you know if you're not going to be a token-like or a project-like what was set out in the turnkey no-action letter, kind of a closed-loop, prepaid access system where the token itself will never appreciate. If you're going the other direction, if you're trying to have a token, a protocol that's intended to be decentralized, what does that mean that I do? So first of all, as many folks know, you need a certain amount of centralization in order to achieve the functionality that's intended for the token or the protocol. That goes back to, as Jerry said, that goes back to Ethereum, where there's got to be some central group of people or entities that ensure that the token or platform has utility. Second is, then there's a course of steps that presumably one should take to then decentralize that. Jerry talked about the kind of hit by the bus test. If you were hit by a bus, would the protocol continue, or the flip side? If you said we should change X, Y, Z, would that actually happen? Okay, so those are good tests. The problem is those aren't articulated quite yet. If you've read the SEC's framework, it's great. It's a great compilation. There's, what, 60 different criteria that are laid out in there under a couple of different headings that are a little different than the way that the Supreme Court laid out the Howey test and elsewhere. So it requires a lot of parsing still. So where we still are is in a situation where the independent agencies and commissions like the SEC and others, they can take things so far. But ultimately, at the end of the day, and under the way that our system of government is structured, these independent commissions and regulatory agencies are creatures of Congress. And it's ultimately their job to implement the legislative direction that Congress lays out. And so for some of the kind of the key questions about bright lines, about top-line policy decisions, about issues of definition, particularly jurisdiction, these are things where the agencies are only going to be able to go so far. And you really need Congress to be able to act and say, look, this is our intent. This is what we think. These are the top-line policy decisions, so that the agency can then implement that, and then industry can understand what the expectations are.
Thank you, Alan. Well, I think that tees up nicely for Congressman Davidson. Congressman Davidson, you have been in Congress, I guess, what, about 3 years now?
Yep.
You're relatively new to the Financial Services Committee. Can you tell us a little bit how you found yourself in the heart of this complex issue facing the cryptocurrency industry? And also tell us a little bit about the Token Taxonomy Act and where you see it going from here.
Well, the short version is in 2015, I was minding my own business in business, and then Speaker Boehner decided to resign. So I decided to run for Congress. So then I got to Congress, and then you go, I haven't met anyone who ran for Congress to deal with the crypto economy or blockchain or frankly just about any aspect of technology. But it is one of the important spaces. So once I get onto the Financial Services Committee, you look at the space and say what is the jurisdiction and what are the issues that are going on. And literally the U.S. is the world's land of opportunity. I mean, capital comes here, goods, services, people, everyone wants to be here because we've got this great mix of legislative certainty, rule of law, and freedom. And so over time, our markets have flourished. And unfortunately, with something that we've been innovators in this space, you're seeing capital formation flee for other areas. And they're not fleeing for areas that have anarchy and chaos. They're fleeing for areas that have some level of legislative certainty. And certainty that lets them flourish. And so it drew my attention, and the other part of my current workplace, there's a little tension there from time to time. There's a few partisan issues. And so you look at issues in the financial services space, and I was talking with Senator Crapo on the Senate side. I'm like, we pass all kinds of things here in the House, and we see it go nowhere. So what can we do with respect to this issue? And he's like, no. What about this? Nope, can't get that through the Senate. I'm like, well, what about ICOs and the crypto market? And we agree that that is fairly nonpartisan. So you look at the piece, this is almost a year ago, really probably over a year ago now, and we started in May of last year trying to convene. And look, I at that point, kind of a red shirt freshman. I came in a special election in 2016, got 6 months of the Obama administration in as a member of the House, and then the last Congress. So I'm obviously not a chairman. I don't have the ability to convene things. So what we did is we just had a conference, and we set out to have 30 people come, and then people started hearing about it, and they started sending, you know, higher level execs, and then bigger companies started coming, and we had, you know, some of the biggest names in the space show up for this roundtable that we had in September last year. So then we put together the framework and said, where do the common denominators come? Because, you know, we just know the problem. We don't necessarily know back then the solution, and then you run into the challenges of Congress and the structure. So we've put together a bill called the Token Taxonomy Act. We dropped it at the end of December, intentionally, knowing, hey, we're not going to get a hearing, this is never going to become law, but we'll be able to get comment. We're going public with the work that we did to gather information over this time. So we got some comments, and we kind of tweaked it, and we have a new version that's out. It's the Token Taxonomy Act of 2016, or 2019, dated. And you know, what happens next? Well, we're continuing to get public comment on it. Some people love it, some people hate it, some people want massively bigger frameworks, and at least one of my colleagues last week probably made the news for those of you that are following the space, where he wants to outlaw Americans from even purchasing crypto assets. So we've got our work to do. So what happens next? We need to convene hearings in Congress so that you get this input from all points of view, and then members of Congress hopefully ask good, intelligent questions, understand the problem, and then we come back and pass a law. My offering is this bill, the Token Taxonomy Act, and you know, I was talking earlier with some folks, and they said, is this your goal to pass this precise language? And it's not. My goal is to provide legislative certainty, light touch that keeps the capital formation happening, but something that will stand the test of time. So you're not dependent upon whomever is the next chair of the SEC to decide whether it's a security or not. This is why the U.S. has flourished in some places that it's regime specific haven't. So in the U.S., even if the SEC absolutely hates this product and says this is just horrible that this should exist, if it meets the criteria, then it's not a security. On the other side, no matter how great that people want it to be different, if it meets the other side of the test, then okay, well then you have to follow the securities law. And you know, of course, there's lots of things in securities law that I would like to change. And that's a different path. Here, if it's a security, we have to get to where the industry follows security law. And you know, for a while, early stage, you had essentially regulatory arbitrage going on, and you had people acting in good faith that were doing regulatory arbitrage, ICOs, and then unfortunately you had some bad actors. And we as a community need to deal with those bad actors and provide the legislative certainty so that we can protect consumers, that we can have you know, all the good things that our markets have provided, and you know, keep seeing the U.S. as this great destination for capital.
Thank you. Real quick, I don't have a clock up here, so someone's going to have to tell me, because we can talk about this stuff all day. But in the meantime, I'll go to my next question. And for the Congressman or Alan, Jerry, feel free to chime in. It's, you know, for someone like me who spent 10 years working on Capitol Hill and has worked as a lobbyist ever since, the policymaking process is an understandable thing. After a while, you get to understand it. But I'm sure for many of the folks here who are busy being productive and creating things, it probably seems a little bit of a black box. What are, you know, as you mentioned, it's an early stage. The first step is to put out a proposal, and then you take comment and you improve it and change it. But what are some of the challenges that we have in the short term, in addition to getting some hearings, to getting this bill moved forward? And what do you think is sort of the timeline this year for seeing some action on this bill?
Yeah, so great question. And you know, I think to understand the process, you know, this is a pretty serious body of law, so you're going to have hearings. And when you get to the hearings, you've probably I know C-SPAN's ratings are probably really, up there. Not quite at the Super Bowl level, but anyway, so you look at C-SPAN, you go on and you're like, where's everybody at? The reality is members of Congress, when there's a hearing, they'll pop in and out of the hearing, they'll take meetings. In general, we're scheduled in about 20-minute blocks all day, meeting with groups. And so you'll pop into the hearing and you will be dependent upon how much, some people will not spend a lot of time on this topic, for example, even if we get a hearing. So how do you make the most of that? All across America, get with your members of Congress, and when you get on one of our calendars, here's what happens. You push the staff to prepare for the meeting. So when I go into a meeting, I will have staff work that's done that'll say, here's who you're meeting with, here's why we're taking the meeting, here's what it relates to, and you get a good briefing that you go in and try to make the meeting productive. And you want to ask for an hour. If you ask for a 20-minute meeting, there won't be as much prep. Get a block of an hour. And then say, who do you meet with? And you look at the structure. This goes through the House Financial Services Committee. Right now, Republicans aren't in the majority. The good news is this is a nonpartisan topic. Although I do have more Republicans that are interested in being co-sponsors, we've kept it at 3 and 3, so it's not viewed as a partisan topic. And in the House, you've got the new FinTech task force that got set up. On the Democratic side, Steve Lynch from Massachusetts is the leader of that. Carolyn Maloney here in New York is the chairwoman of the Capital Markets Subcommittee, so this oversees all of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And then obviously Maxine Waters is the chair of the overall committee. So those three are probably the three most important people to meet with, but when you look at who else is going to make up those hearings, that's where it's important, frankly, the work that you guys have done to help connect, because entrepreneurs don't necessarily want to meet with members of Congress, and members of Congress are generally spending, if you look at the content of the calendar, most members the meetings they take are with incumbents, people that are already in the space, that are established, that have a presence, they spend their time, they know the connectivity. A lot of entrepreneurs, you don't have like extra person on the org chart to do anything, let alone do regulatory stuff. And so even if you're small and you've got an event going on in Los Angeles, invite Maxine Waters and her staff to it. If you got an event going on in Massachusetts, get Steve Lynch and his staff there. In New York, get Carolyn Maloney and her staff there. And then for anybody else in America, I mean, don't forget about flyover country, particularly Ohio. We'd love to have your capital formation right there.
I want to touch on one last issue quickly, and then we'll wrap up because I think it's about time to go. But another issue in the Token Taxonomy Act deals with some of the tax provisions that are in there. I know that both Jerry and Alan have also worked very much on this issue. Jerry, do you want to give us just a super quick kind of top line? What are some of the major issues that need to be addressed via legislation, or maybe the major issue?
Sure. So I'll first say that there are many, about at least a half a dozen really basic open questions about how individuals can comply with their tax obligations related to crypto that the IRS and Treasury have just not been forthcoming with guidance. It's something that they've been asked to do many times over the last 5 years by the GAO, the Inspector General for Tax Administration, the Public Advocate, the ABA, the Association for Accountants, us, and they haven't. And so we're encouraging them to answer these basic questions. Now, there's some things that only Congress can do, or at least it seems that only Congress can do. And for example, one thing that is in the Token Taxonomy Act is the Token Taxonomy Act takes the language of a bill that was introduced last Congress by Representative Schweikert, Representative Polis, and I think is going to be reintroduced this year again as a standalone bill, that creates a de minimis exemption for cryptocurrency transactions under $600. And simply what that does is this. We used to have this problem in foreign currency. So if you are a currency trader and you buy $1 million worth of euro because you think the price of the euro is going to go up, and then it does go up, and a week later you sell that that euro for $2 million, you've made some capital gain there and you need to pay taxes on that. Great, that makes sense. But now let's say you buy 100 euro because you're going on to vacation in France. And while you're in France, while you're on your trip, the price of the euro goes up and you buy a baguette. Okay, technically, you've experienced a capital gain. And technically, in the up to the 1990s, you technically had to report that, count that gain, report that gain to the IRS, and pay tax on that gain. And of course, nobody complied with this law because it makes no sense. And what Congress did, you can't have a law nobody complies with, so Congress fixed it. They created a de minimis exemption for personal foreign currency transactions, and it was a $200, it is a $200 limit. So when you go to France with your euros, you don't have to worry about the tax implications. That does not exist for cryptocurrency, because cryptocurrency is property, it's not currency, so it's not foreign currency, so there's no existing de minimis exemption. So quite simply, what the de minimis bill does is create a $600 exemption. So if you are buying crypto as an investment, you're going to have to count your capital gains. But if you buy crypto and you use it to buy a laptop, buy a plane ticket, buy a cup of coffee, or very importantly, if you use it to run a smart contract, okay? When you run a smart contract on the Ethereum network, you're going to have to spend a little bit for a mining fee. And technically that is a disposition of crypto that technically you should be calculating any capital gain or loss on. It's the kind of thing, again, nobody's complying with. If we wanted to enforce that, it would make all of these cryptocurrency networks basically impossible to use legally. That's not going to happen, and so we're hoping that a bill like this gets passed.
Well, I think that's all the time we have today, but thank you very much to our panelists. And